Roman baths have been held up as a high point in the context of health and hygiene in the ancient world, and the whole practice of bathing is something seen as quintessentially Roman.
But is this really the case? Were the baths a place of good hygiene, or did they supply the opposite set of conditions, in which you could pick up something nasty or make a condition worse?
Join me and special guest expert Emma as we look at the baths in the context of health and hygiene and try to reframe how good for you the baths really were.
What have the Romans ever done for us?
Hi, and thanks for downloading. You're listening to Ancient History Hound, a podcast where I look at various aspects of antiquity. My name is Neil, and you can find lots of ancient history content on my website where I have links to my YouTube, Facebook and Instagram. It's www.ancientblogger.com. I'm also on Twitter as @ancientblogger. As per the intro, in this episode we're looking at the Roman baths and how hygienic they really were. And I say we because I'm joined by my special guest expert Emma.
Hi, I'm Emma. I am a trained scientist, I suppose you'd say. I've got a degree in biomedical science and I'm doing a master's in infectious diseases at the moment. So I like science and I particularly like any sort of infectious diseases, anything that is a bit gross or a bit unusual that can cause humans to suffer. Kind of my bag.
Yeah, one thing I really learned from speaking to Emma is most biologists or scientists seem to have a favourite disease or a favourite something horrible.
Yep.
It can make for an interesting discussion. I think it was around a year ago we did a podcast on STIs in antiquity and it ended up becoming 2 episodes and it's back there, so if you want to listen to it, please do so. Just download it. It's on the same place wherever you got this episode. I got a message from someone who listened. They made their teenage son listen to the STIs in Antiquity podcast. I don't know, I should say, if that's because they thought this teenager could inherently do with learning more about that sort of thing, or whether it was just to put them off sex.
STIs are a fascinating subject and teenagers could always do with knowing more. I don't know about putting people off sex, but definitely equipping them with knowledge is always useful.
Knowledge and fear. In any case, I learned a hell of a load about talking about STIs and different STIs, STDs. It was all about what sort of ones we have evidence for, how they might have been treated, all that kind of stuff. So it was a pretty gruesome subject, but worth listening to after lunch.
Or if you're a biologist, whenever you feel like it.
Just don't care if you're a biologist.
If you have a strong stomach, it's fine.
Well, yeah. This feeds into a podcast I recently did on the history of baths or history of bathing and how it developed in Rome. We're looking at what sort of conditions the Roman baths presented to you if you were wandering around a major Roman city or Rome itself in the middle of the 1st century AD. And I know you listened to it.
Obviously listened to it the first time it came out because I subscribed to you and I listened to all of your episodes anyway. But I had a little extra listen and made some notes. And the first thing that jumped out at me was that one of the first things that was said was that baths distract and emasculate men.
Yeah.
Which I quite I don't know why that amused me so much.
That was something that I believe Aristophanes in the 5th century BC said about Greek bathing. He wasn't particularly keen on lots of young men not being at the exercise yards or exercise places, the palestras and places like that, and instead going to these places, and it was seen as quite, I wouldn't say a feminine activity, but it wasn't seen as a manly activity in the Greek mind frame. And I know that is echoed later on when you have the Romans perceiving, and if anyone's ever studied Rome, you'll know that Rome is if nothing but crammed full of cranky old men telling everyone when they were young things were much easier, much simpler. It was a simpler time and a better time.
Nothing that doesn't happen now either. Maybe the bathing doesn't, but certainly people saying that things were better back in the day. But yeah, the difference between the Greek and Roman bathing I found quite interesting, but there were quite a lot of generic similarities. The idea that the Greeks even knew back then that warm bathing aided recovery and rest physically was an interesting one. Not that they necessarily knew the science behind it, but I wasn't expecting it to be that obvious. I thought it was more of a social activity, and obviously it was a social activity as well, but they were aware of that thing, and also that it was more of a gym health club than a bath as we know it now. When you hear about Roman baths, I think in modern way, we think the word bath, you think of a literal bath, and so it wasn't just a hot room where someone bathed and had a chat. It was, there was the tepidarium, is it? And the
Yeah.
frigidarium, so all these different temperatures and everything. It was kind of more of a spa or a health club vibe.
That was certainly something that I expected there to be more submerging, and that's not really the case. There was a number of different areas where you can do different things. There were some baths that later ended up having libraries in them. I think the Roman baths served that function as a sort of community node or community hub.
Yeah, and that was one of the things that I actually thought and I wrote down, was that it's a lot more social.
So just to give you an outline of what we're going to do, we're going to talk about some of the diseases or illnesses, or just, I suppose you call them, conditions that were faced or were taken upon by people in mid-1st century AD Rome, and how the baths may or may not have made them better. I do have a caveat of these are generally agreed conditions that were prevalent, and we're going to look at each of them. And we're also going to talk about the hygiene of Rome generally. But
Yeah,
anyway,
there's a real misconception from a layman's part, as in mine, that these baths were this kind of pinnacle of health and almost spa-like as we view them today, but they definitely weren't like that. And in reference to diseases and conditions and things, they were set up almost perfectly for some diseases to exist or to be transmitted. So that's what we're going to look at.
in fact, one of the quotes I read put it really quite well. They posited the point that Rome was perfect for smaller diseases to get a foothold in, because you had a growing population, you had a large enough population that had existed with new people coming in all the time. Conditions were created to allow certain diseases a foothold, which perhaps they wouldn't have had in other parts of the Roman Empire. I think when you reference, or when you're talking about the facilities, and we automatically equate that means healthy, a good example of this is the aqueducts and the fountains in the city of Rome, because you could have really quite nice fresh water brought in. But what if the fountains are polluted? What if you've got a point of contact issue? And this is seen in developing countries, where you can introduce a water system to a place or location. But if you're not checking how people are accessing that water, you make things worse. And a good example, there's a facade, I seem to remember a facade in one of the water fountains in Pompeii, and it says, please do not pollute this with excrement. Because if you can imagine you're a Roman citizen, or just anyone in Rome, there's a fountain in your district where everyone goes to collect water. If someone goes and accesses water from that fountain and they've not washed their hands, which why would they? There's plenty of animal excrement on the floor. If you then access that water and you pollute that, everyone visiting that point to get the water would also potentially pick up anything that you've transmitted into the water. And I think the Roman baths in many ways has this feature as part of it, and it needs to be respected. So you can make things worse by, in a way, trying to make them healthier, if that I suppose, if that kind of makes sense. But anyway, I'm going to do less talking now and let Emma discuss the various things or various conditions that we agreed upon, and see how they might have been made better or worse by the Roman baths. So take it away, Emma.
The first thing I want to talk about is the difference between diarrhoea and dysentery, which is a fun topic and a fun conversation to have with anybody. But it's one of those things that people aren't always sure about the difference, and they can be used interchangeably. But diarrhoea is a watery type of event, and often things are spread by diarrhoea if ingested, whereas dysentery is different because it's more mucus and blood filled rather than watery. So you may have diarrhoea that then causes a little bit of blood due to physical damage, but generally they are quite different. They are both good at spreading diseases, but they are different, and they are different symptoms to different things. So it's just worth pointing out the difference between those two initially.
And I think that's a good point, because there are references in particularly in Martial about people going to the baths with tummy troubles.
Yes.
One in particular, I think he references someone washing their backside quite vigorously in the baths. Now, again, we don't know if that was within the warm water he was sat in, although that is given as a one of the remedies. I think it's by Celsus, who says, go and sit in some hot water. Whether or not that would have occurred in the baths, we're not totally sure. However, we've got to consider the fact that you're an average Roman citizen, you don't have access to even running water where you live, so what you're going to do is you're going to go to the baths, and perhaps you visit the latrines. The latrines were obviously often placed within baths, and you had a bit of tummy trouble, and then you go and either you're sat in one of the rooms, you're sweating and you're washing yourself with the water in a basin, or you actually sat within one of the smaller sort of hot pools that were with other people.
Well, one of the main similarities or commonalities in a lot of the diseases we're going to look at is the fact that it's fecal oral transmission. So that means basically it's in poo, and if it gets into you, usually orally, either via waterborne or foodborne, then you are more likely to develop the disease. So if you're going to wash your dysentery bum in some warm water, that's not great, particularly because warm water can be good for bacteria to grow, depending on what else is in the water as well, because bacteria need media to grow as well. Not all bacteria are successful to growing in water. I'm not going to go down that path because the bowel trouble sitting in a hot bath, it sounded a bit like gastroenteritis, which is a viral issue. It's known these days either as the norovirus or the rotavirus, and it's very, very, very infectious. Gastroenteritis is the inflammation of stomach and intestines. It's like a generic term, but it's used medically quite often to just mean the side effects of those viral infections. And it's vomiting and diarrhoea. And current NHS guidance actually says you shouldn't swim for up to 2 weeks after having that, after your symptoms have gone, because of how contagious it is and how easily you can infect other people. So if somebody did have gastroenteritis and then they went to a bath because they'd been prescribed that, if it had been within 2 weeks of them getting better, they would still be infectious.
And that's a really, really important point, is that a lot of medicine of that period was about treating an immediate concern, and there wasn't necessarily the understanding that these symptoms would have been manifested at a lower level, under the radar, as it were. So you can go in and think, I'm better now, but actually you're still infectious. And you mentioned about the water, and I think it's really important. People don't quite always... So again, something I wasn't fully aware of, am now. If you were using one of those hot tubs, I suppose they didn't have plug holes. There was an overflow system, and occasionally they would be cleaned and drained, and they were also eating. And you mentioned
I mean, that's the thing. If we look at gastroenteritis initially by itself, it is not just food or waterborne, because it is so infectious, it's person-to-person contact as well. Out of all the ones we're looking at, really, gastroenteritis is the one that I think would spread the easiest in the baths, just because it spreads via the fecal route and also by the oral route and also by person-to-person contact. And I find it very unlikely you wouldn't be having person-to-person contact. And also the 2 weeks, no swimming, no bathing, sharing water with people after you've been ill. Yeah, I think a lot of people would leave it a week and probably be fine, not even a week. I don't know what the guidance would have been in those days.
I don't think really there was.
No, I'm sure the moment you stopped being ill, people just went back to their normal lives.
Yeah.
So I think out of all of them, that would probably have been the most problematic in terms of infection.
And that's really important that you say about the person-to-person, because we've got to remember that the bathing facilities would have incorporated lots of things where people were interacting with each other, not just in the submerged sense or even in one of the hot rooms, but if I'm in the exercise ground and I say let's do some wrestling practice, if I'm having my eyebrows plucked or my armpits plucked, or I'm visited by the barber, which we know occurred within the baths, or I've brought in some olives and I say, do you want to share some? And I'll have a couple of olives, and then you wander off, don't see you the rest of the time. There we go.
Exactly. And most people's immune systems in those days would have been not better than now, but they would have had a lot more exposure to underlying pathogens. In the case of gastroenteritis, at least, it is something that has been and will always be very, very infectious. It's just a very clever virus that gets in and gets out very quickly. Leading on from that, another waterborne one that a lot of people are aware of is cholera. Cholera is a bacterial disease caused by the bacteria Vibrio cholerae, which is one of my favourites to say. And
see what I mean? They have favourites.
Well, it's just nice words as well. It's an acute diarrheal disease, and generally it's eating and drinking transmission. It's a disease that comes up quite quickly and quite frequently after natural disasters. So providing you've got okay sewage and okay sanitation, cholera doesn't tend to happen. But any time, no matter where, whether it's in the developed or the developing world, if there's a hurricane or typhoons or earthquakes, cholera will happen very quickly because it's what we call an opportunistic bacteria. And the thing about Vibrio cholerae that I think would have worked very well in the baths is that there would potentially been an infection of water, not just the water that you're bathing in, but the water that perhaps is drinking and cooking, particularly if people aren't washing their hands. If they've got a bit of a diarrhoea, it's possible that people might have just had a bit of diarrhoea all the time.
Toga's suddenly seen the bad idea when you consider all of this.
Yes.
Perhaps that's why it's just massive toilet paper you're wearing.
But I had to look into how much water you actually ingest if you swim or if you spend a long time in water, because you don't need to actually ingest much cholera bacteria in order for it to start making you ill. About 37 millilitres per hour of being in water is how much you physically swallow if you are swimming. So I'm not sure how that would translate, but I think it would probably translate enough, if we want to estimate it, that if you're spending all day in a bath and you're going in and out of places and getting splashed, and I know and always being submerged, but I do think that is probably quite a lot of ingestion. And so if there are bacterial nasties in the water, the chances are that it would be transmitted. And also cholera lives in water. It likes water. So it's not a bacteria that possibly could be destroyed by heat.
We don't know exactly how hot the water would have been in the hot water rooms, as it were. I always equate even mildly warm water as killing everything.
It doesn't.
That's not the case. What we're saying then with the Roman baths, if we had to say, do they accentuate the risks that we've talked about with dysentery, with diarrhoea, with gastroenteritis and cholera? I think it's safe to say these weren't occurring exclusively as a result of the baths.
No.
These were already in place because the conditions were there for them to happen. Is there any way that we could posit whether or not the baths made them worse or reduced the instances?
I wouldn't say that they reduced the instances. In terms of these diseases, in terms of cholera and in terms of gastroenteritis, in particular gastroenteritis, these are not conditions that are going to help.
So we're going to put this one down as made worse. Definitely
made worse with gastroenteritis. With cholera, it is increasing the risk of passing it on.
Okay.
But again, you can have cholera bacteria in you and be fine. Some people are more genetically susceptible to being infected with cholera than others. And so there are other factors that affect that.
Up next then is malaria.
Malaria is a really interesting disease, and a lot of people have heard about malaria because it is devastating. I think it is the biggest killer in the world today, and it has been for a long time. But it's not just one disease. There are several forms. Effectively, malaria is caused by a parasite called Plasmodium, and there are different types of Plasmodium that cause slightly different forms of malaria, and a lot of people aren't aware that there are different forms. The main type of malaria that is in the news a lot and that has been in the news recently is caused by Plasmodium falciparum, and that's the one that they're managing to develop a vaccine against. But there are 4 others types of malaria, so Plasmodium vivax, Plasmodium malariae, Plasmodium ovale, sorry, I'm terrible at saying that word, and Plasmodium knowlesi. Different mosquitoes may carry them, and they also cause different symptoms. And the main thing that comes out in regards to malaria is that they used to be classified before we were able to look at the different types of Plasmodium and classify those according to their fever cycles. And what that means is the length of the fever, because malaria, if you do or don't know, I'm going to tell you anyway, it causes a fever, but it's not a continuous fever, it's a cyclic fever. And you can have a tertian fever, which is 3 days, or a quartan fever, which is 4 days. And different forms of malaria caused by those different versions of Plasmodium will cause those different types of fever. When people say malaria, there are so many different ways you can chop that up. You can say, well, are you talking about it if it's been looked at by the fever length, the cycle length, or are you talking about it in regards to the parasite? Now, obviously, in the data that we looked at, or the information we looked at from ancient times, they talked about fever cycles rather than the parasites, because they wouldn't have been able to see the parasites in those days.
They were driven by the visual symptoms. So if someone was repeatedly ill, then they'd measure the time scales involved.
Exactly.
And I suppose that's how they would have understood it.
Exactly. And the thing about malaria that makes it such a problem is that it's caused by breeding mosquitoes. It's transmitted by breeding mosquitoes, it's caused by the Plasmodium. But it's only transmitted by females, because breeding females need blood to survive, which is pretty hardcore.
Yeah.
To be honest with you. In the case of Plasmodium falciparum, it's transmitted by the female Anopheles mosquito when she is breeding. Now, breeding cycles are more in the summer because of the heat, and mosquitoes love to breed in standing water.
This is where
the problem is. If the Tiber is flooding all the time, there's going to be standing water. You've got a cup of water, mosquitoes can breed in there. We're talking about all types of places. They can breed in large still bodies of water. They can breed in tiny still bodies of water. In developing worlds now, you've got malarial prevention teams going around making people make sure that tyres aren't on their sides because rainwater may gather in them and cause malarial breeding, or even tin cans. Soda cans have even been found to be able to be where malaria.
So in a way, it might be the facility itself. What we're talking about, what we might be considering here is you've got a large complex and part of it requires water.
We're thinking about, in this situation, you need standing water that's quite dirty. Well, it doesn't always need to be dirty, but it's helpful if it is. And so you're looking at little puddles and little pools. Someone leaves a plate out or a cup
there's
out.
An M4 or two kicking around and they're stuck in a storeroom somewhere and they've got water in because they didn't bother taking it out at some point. If you've already got something wrong with you,
yeah,
and you're not brilliant, underlying conditions, shall we say, you get malaria and it kills you off.
Absolutely.
So it's not the malaria that necessarily kills you. It is, I suppose, the straw that broke the camel's back.
It's one of the reasons that it is such a killer now is because of in the developing world, children who have lower, their immune systems aren't strong. Older people who have weaker immune systems, people who are immunocompromised will have weaker immune systems, and they are more likely to die from malaria, mostly because of what it does. Without going into too much detail, it infects your liver and it infects your blood system, and so it stops them from functioning correctly. But also it's difficult for your body to deal with a fever over a long period of time, particularly a repetitive fever over a long period of time, and that puts a strain on the body. And I was going to talk about in a while about the fever and what sort of strain it causes, but that is why people are more likely to die. So if you've got a disease like malaria, which will cause this cyclic fevering for so long until you get better, if you even get better, because malaria can often stay inside you and then crop up again later, then you are going to be more likely to die.
You're not really going to get malaria by virtue of visiting the baths.
No.
However, the baths themselves possibly allowed mosquitoes.
I would go so far as saying that the conditions around the baths would be a great breeding ground.
Yeah, opportunistic. We talked opportunistic earlier about cholera. Opportunistic breeding for any mosquitoes. The baths would have provided that.
Definitely.
Right. What have you got next for us? What fun one?
I might as well talk about fevers now, since we've been talking about fevers, because there was a whole thing about doctors saying go and sit in a hot bath and sort out a fever.
Yeah, there were a few references by, I think it's Celsus. You had a fever, you'd go to the baths. So, Emma, was that a good idea?
No, it wasn't.
There we go.
That's it. That's all I'm going to say.
There we go. End of
no,
podcast.
Nothing. A fever is over a temperature over 37.5 degrees C, just in case anyone was wondering. And they can have loads and loads of causes. So, like we've talked about, malaria, gastroenteritis can cause a fever as well, viral infections, many things. Effectively, your body makes itself hotter to try and kill any parasites or any bacterial infections. That's the basics behind what a fever is. It's your body being quite clever and responding to invaders by going, right, I'm going to get really hot so everything dies, but unfortunately it can end up killing you as well. It causes, generally, if you've got a fever and you go and sit somewhere really hot, it can cause heart stress. Now, your heart will already be under stress if you've got a fever. And so heart stress on heart stress is going to cause something very bad, usually heart failure or heart attack.
Heart stress on heart stress. That sounds like a really good band.
Or an 80s album,
80s power band.
The control of your body temperature is from the hypothalamus in the brain. The hypothalamus detects something called pyrogens, which either come from inflamed body tissue that have been attacked by pathogens or from the pathogens themselves. But what it does is that then stimulates your immune system to react, and that's why your temperature, your core temperature, goes up. You get hotter and hotter and hotter, and then hopefully your bacteria and viruses that have infected you will not survive. And so that's the idea around a fever. But going to sit in somewhere hot when you already have a fever is going to give you a heart attack.
So it's effectively, it's not a good thing to do. We're assuming, again, that you're going to the baths to do that. You might also want to go and sit, perhaps you want to go in the plunge pool, go in one of the cooler rooms. But either way, we're assuming that might have been the instance, in which case it's not a good. So I think for fevers, we've got that down.
I think sitting in the cool areas, the frigidarium,
Yeah, plunge pool.
the plunge pool would have been a better way of dealing with it. But really, if you've got a fever, you probably just need to sit at home and drink water.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's not a good idea. So don't do that, kids.
No. Say no to...
Say no to sweating out a fever unless it's
Yeah.
just your body sweating it out. So we're going to look at a disease that is parasitic now. Although malaria is parasitic as well, this is a different sort of parasitic disease. And it causes a condition, depending on where you are in the world, you will either have heard it being called amoebiasis or amoebic dysentery. And it is caused by a parasite of the entamoeba family, so it's an amoeba. Generally, entamoeba histolytica. It's got two infectious forms. The infectious forms are to do with the life cycle of the amoeba. There are cysts and there are trophozoites, which exist. The trophozoites exist in diarrheal stool or dysentery stool. Those trophozoites would survive in water.
So we're considering those warm pools, as it were, that you might want to sit in for a bit.
Yeah.
This is potentially the kind of breeding ground for that sort of thing. Well, not the breeding ground, but the place where it's going to go and enjoy itself, waiting for someone else to come along.
Absolutely. And the thing about these amoebas that are quite clever is that the cysts, which are the more successful transmission forms, another part of the life cycle, live in water, in food, and they can actually survive on the hands. Under the fingernails, they can survive for up to 45 minutes. And they can live in water and food for longer than that. If you've got someone, again...
You're giving it the opportunity.
Yeah.
You're giving... The baths, I suppose, give this sort of disease the opportunity to...
It gives this parasite the opportunity to be transmitted, yes. And the other way that it can be transmitted, because of the fact that it can be fecally transmitted, is through anal sex as well. It's a rare type of parasitic infection, this and giardiasis, that can be transmitted anally.
That gives us a segue into the next genre of disease.
The next genre of disease is one that no one at the baths really has to worry about unless they're having sex in the baths, and that's gonorrhea.
Yeah.
Gonorrhea is caused by Neisseria gonorrhoeae, which is one of my favourites. And again, this is one of my favourite STIs because it's very clever from a microbiological perspective. I'm not going to go into it.
No, we did cover this. This was covered because it's referenced quite a lot in antiquity. So if you want to hear more about gonorrhea in antiquity, and why not, then you can check it out on the podcast we did on STIs in antiquity.
I'm not going to geek out about how much I love gonorrhea. However, I am going to say that almost every single sexually transmitted infection, even if somebody is secreting sexual fluids into water, are not going to get passed on.
So if I'm sat in one of the hot tubs, warm tubs again, and there's a chap next to me who has got gonorrhea, I'm not going to...
No, there is no concern in regards to that. They are sexually transmitted infections. It needs to be mucous membrane on sexual fluid, mucous membrane on mucous membrane. That is all you have to worry about. So baths do not assist.
No.
Other than being a place where people might be having lots of sex together, they don't.
Yeah,
assist the
and again, this is something that we sort of referred to earlier. There is obviously that. I think I mentioned in my previous podcast on Greek and Roman bathing I think it was Pompeii. It's argued that one of the baths was actually had a brothel upstairs, and we know from Marshall that there are lots of things going on in baths. So really the baths themselves, you're not going to get a disease, STI or STD, from going there, but it's just somewhere you could end up hooking up, catching something. It's not going to give you...
But that's not the bath's fault. You can catch it anyway.
Don't blame the bath.
Wherever you're doing it, you're going to get it. Well, you might get it. So yeah, any sexually transmitted infection, unfortunately, I'm not going to talk very much about because it's not that relevant in this situation. There are a couple of lung diseases that come up. So in regards to pleurisy, it's an inflammation of the membranes that surround the lungs and line the chest cavity. And it's usually caused by a virus or a side effect of another infection. It's nothing that would be caused or nothing that would necessarily breed or be transmitted in the baths.
Okay.
Hot air might help soothe the symptoms of pleurisy, but really it's one of those things that's a bit holistic in that, go and breathe some hot air in and relax, you might feel better. There's no curative purpose from going into a hot pool or a cool pool or anything. So pleurisy did exist, but it was probably a side effect of other infections, and really being at the baths may have made a slight difference in terms of someone's feeling better, but there was no cure. I
wonder to what extent the baths exacerbated particular types of condition involved in the lungs, simply because in some of the criticisms, and I think it's Cicero, I could be wrong, complains about the modern baths having windows being much more aired. And he says the good old days, you had your baths and they were dingy and you just had oil lamps and very sooty. And one of the considerations regards to this that I've read is that there was a lot of soot in the housing of ancient Rome because people were constantly burning things, well, simply for light. And if that's the case, and you go to the baths of, say, the earlier versions of the baths, you're encountering more of that. You're sat around breathing in lots of burnt substances, and I just wonder if that might cause...
Well, there is a disorder called anthracosis, which is effectively coal dust in the lungs or any kind of pollutant, but it needs to be a lot of burnt stuff. So these days you wouldn't get it so much, but in those days, coal dust, oil lamp, any kind of dust or smoke. It's a chronic lung disease. It does exist now, but only really with people who work in particular.
I imagine miners, people who used to work in the mines.
Yeah, that kind of thing. I mean, it's kind of in the realm of asthma and COPD, which is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. It's known as black lung disease or miner's asthma as well. Yeah. And effectively there's no cure for it. It's palliative, that's all.
So it's possibly made worse by
the baths and saunas wouldn't help at all.
If you're going to lots of... And I think, again, we need to consider what type of baths you're going to. If you're going to these really nice, fancy, open-air baths that have got lots of windows, less so. If you're going to the oldie type of baths where it's, dark rooms with oil and you can sit around them, you're not getting away from it, put it that way. It wouldn't be the only place you'd experience those sorts of conditions, but at the same time, it's not going to help.
No, exactly. And the last one, which the baths would not have helped in regards to, or would have actually helped a lot in regards to the transmission, is tuberculosis.
Yeah. This is something, when I was doing my initial reading on it, tuberculosis pings a lot when you're looking up disease in ancient Rome.
Yeah, I mean, out of the two things that would be most contagious, like I said before, was gastroenteritis from a viral perspective, and from a bacterial perspective it would be tuberculosis. It's caused by a bacteria called Mycobacterium tuberculosis, and it's person to person, airborne. So it's an airborne, but it's transmitted very, very easily person to person. If you spend lots of time with somebody, you're more likely to get infected. The only thing is that someone must have an active TB infection, but that just means that they're coughing up the bacteria. And so if you've got somebody who's got tuberculosis who's been told to go and sit in the baths because they're not feeling great and they're next to someone else and they're coughing, the chances are they are going to get tuberculosis. You get it a lot in developing countries, in situations where there are lots of people living together in crowded situations, in crowded housing.
Which is perfect for a particular demographic in ancient Rome, where you'd have people living in very small rooms, lots of them in a I suppose, condensed living. And I do remember reading, and I think it's Pliny, one of Pliny's letters, and he says one of his freedmen he sends on a bit of a cruise, because he starts bringing up blood, he starts coughing up blood, so he sends him out for fresh air, as it were. And I think that's we don't know, we couldn't diagnose the guy, but we would think that that's possibly tuberculosis.
Exactly. And the other thing that's quite interesting was, when I was looking into this, is that swimming pool injuries are more likely to increase the frequency of TB transmission as well. Any kind of scrapes or cuts in water, for some reason, I couldn't find out why, but there were enough medical scientific articles on this to say that if people are scraped or hurt in water and they're around people with active tuberculosis, they're more likely to get it. Not just pulmonary tuberculosis, but other forms of tuberculosis
Does this have to be... the actual injury has to occur whilst you're submerged?
Well, they called them swimming pool injuries, but I think it's any injury that is fresh and you're in the water.
Because just to clarify on swimming pools, what we consider swimming pools weren't really that present in antiquity. The pools weren't that big. I think there's one in one of the Pompeian baths is 12 metres by 8 metres, and it's 1.5 metres deep. So these aren't grand, large swimming pools as a general rule. Obviously, the larger baths, the really big later imperial baths might have had them. These weren't. Now, what I'm thinking here is they did have exercise grounds. They had places where you could catch ball, wrestle, do all sorts. So
if you're doing that and then going into water,
and then you get so you get a bit of a bruise, bit of a cut from some rough and tumble, and then you go and submerge yourself, and you've got a cut or a wound or just a graze, like you say.
But the other thing is, the idea, as far as I could tell from the reading I did, was that swimming pool injuries are hurting yourselves on the sides of swimming pools.
Right, so that's where
you're probably more likely to do that if you've got a smaller area that you're bathing in or plunging in.
Yeah, possibly again. Yeah. Okay,
so,
fair play.
TB several ways you're more likely to get something or catch it if you are in a bath.
So far, the baths, just to recap, they're not doing brilliantly.
No.
They're either recreating existing conditions, which weren't particularly hygienic, or they're making ones far worse.
Yeah, I mean, they're not necessarily making it worse for the individual, but in terms of transmission of things, definitely. And then we'll move on to one that it doesn't affect at all, because we've done one already with the sexually transmitted infections. This is rabies.
I'm pretty sure it's Celsus who advises that if you get rabies, one of the treatments is to go to the baths and keep the wound open where you've been bitten and make sure that you let the poison ooze out. And I think that was a great example of how unhygienic the baths could be, because that could cover a number of situations. And in fact, we have other commentators saying don't go to the baths if you've got an open cut, because you can end up getting infections and gangrene and all sorts. I don't know if they refer to it as gangrene, but
yeah, I mean, the advice in regards to letting the poison leach out, it's quite an interesting one, because rabies is caused by the rabies virus. You can tell that was discovered quite recently because it doesn't have a fancy name.
No.
And it doesn't travel in your blood system. It goes into your nerves, and it takes a while to move up to your brain, which is when it causes the hydrophobia, which is the fear of water. So you can't bleed out from your nerves. So the moment the infection, the virus gets into your nervous system, that is it. You can't, bleed it out. Not that you can really bleed out any disease, but there's no logic there at all. But of course, they probably weren't even aware of the nervous system.
If you think about, much like if you're bitten by a snake, they're aware that there's envenomation there. There's a process or something going into you. Perhaps it was thought people bitten by dogs that are a bit crazy. Person then becomes crazy, it must be something the dog gave the person, which
then that's perfectly logical, but my point is that it's quite an unusual disease in that it does travel in the nervous system. And if you are bitten by a rabid dog, listeners, go to the doctor and you can get treatment, because what you do is if you leave it for too long and you don't get treatment, then you will die. Something happened very recently. A guy in Morocco got bitten by...
was it a kitten?
I think it was a cat,
someone who got bitten by a kitten.
And he went to the doctor a few times and they didn't give him the rabies vaccination, or they might have then realised he did have it and gave it to him way late. But you can get vaccinations even after you've been bitten, which will stop you from dying. But it's if you leave it and you leave it. Sam Fox, who was a musician and glamour model, got rabies.
Really?
Yeah. And but she was...
How did she get that? Was it, again, bitten by
I think it might have been a bat.
Ooh, that is terrifying.
Bats are frequent.
Oh, no, yeah.
Bats carry loads of stuff. I mean, I don't think we've ever talked about Ebola, but bats are reservoirs for very, very many diseases. They're incredible animals because they can just have it. They can just have everything. They can have malaria, they can have Ebola, they can have rabies.
If you're going to sleep with a bat, wear protection.
In essence, rabies, you need to be bitten.
I never thought of citing this example because of rabies itself. It also pointed to the fact that people were going to the baths if they had those kind of injuries. The idea of if you had an open wound, go to the baths. It's not always the case because we do have contradicting advice on that, but it was still that idea of the baths being seen as a place to go and heal. So how do you mix the ill and the sick? Now, it is suggested that some baths had opening hours, particularly in the morning. If you listen to the last podcast I did on the Greek and Roman bathing, generally speaking, most people would go there in the late afternoon, and the idea was in the morning. In some baths, people who were ill would go. So you'd have kind of people going there, which itself is pretty scary, because if you go there and you've got one particular illness and your immunity is below where it should be, and you're just getting exposed to a whole bunch of other possible...
Yeah, so they're going to make you super immune, or you're going to get super ill.
Yeah. What have we got left? Have we got any more?
We've got typhoid to look at, and then we're going to talk about activities in the baths.
So what with typhoid?
Typhoid is caused by a bacteria, Salmonella typhi or Salmonella paratyphi, depending on which type it is.
Which type of typhoid?
Which type of typhoid? It's spread from people with active infections, person to person, and also fecally as well. What's interesting about this one is you can have an active infection and feel fine. So contaminated food and water and sewage. And by sewage, we don't mean the sort of sewage you might imagine, but anything that has any kind of fecal matter. It's very contagious. And so typhoid leads to fever, and you can eventually die. Effectively, that's something that would transmit quite easily. So that's another one to put on the top three that we have.
I think it's typhoid. It's one of those diseases that's often cited as the plague of Athens, which happened at the beginning of the Peloponnesian War in 431 BCE. you can talk about activities, something by virtue of being an option at the baths, which can make a condition worse or just make you generally ill.
So 2 things that I wanted to talk about were having massages and hair plucking, and also drinking heavily. Massages can cause lymphatic drainage and might dehydrate you, and then you could get further dehydrated by going in and sitting in a hot room. But generally massages don't carry that much infection risk at all.
No, I think that the massages, you've got person-to-person transmission.
Yeah.
You've got lots of touching. This wouldn't have been the option in every single bath. Again, we're not talking about a standardised menu that would have occurred. We know, I think there's that letter that Seneca writes about living next door to baths, and he's part of it. He says about he can hear people being pummeled and slapped by the masseurs. But he can also hear people having their armpits plucked and whatnot, and shrieking and screaming. I mean, it just goes to show that some baths had a really large number of options to go there. I mean, I mentioned it again in the previous podcast about you could go there and get a lawyer. It was a real social kind of hub, as it were. So the massages possible make things worse.
Yeah, only in a small amount. But in terms of plucking, you can get a condition called folliculitis, which is inflammation of hair follicles, and that can cause quite a nasty infection. So it could be an infection risk. It can eventually lead to septicemia and death if it doesn't get treated, and these days it's treated with antibiotics. So it is something that could have happened, that could have ended up with people dying if your hair follicles get infected, particularly in certain areas where hair is plucked. Ingrowing hairs in the pubic regions, so under your arms and in your groin, are more prone to folliculitis. And so if those areas are being plucked, and there is an infection risk there. So, if you get everything plucked and then you end up going into a pool where perhaps you get a little bit of an infection, a little bit of bacterial infection, that can then cause quite a bad infection, which can go systemically throughout your body and kill you.
Could we do drinking heavily?
You went from that very quickly.
I know. I was really fascinated by
You can
this.
do drinking heavily. There was a woman... Was it with the
juveniles
3-gallon thirst or something?
Who went there again. This is quite a difficult one to understand fully. Juvenile references a wife, various types of wives, and one of them goes down to the baths simply to cook herself and build up a 3-gallon thirst, and then she hosts a dinner party, and it doesn't go well. So Emma, effects of alcohol after effectively dehydrating yourself really quite heavily.
The first thing would be dehydration, which is caused by alcohol anyway. So if you are already dehydrated and then you dehydrate yourself even more, it can lead to heat stroke. And heat stroke is effectively an inability to maintain correct blood pressure. A lot of people don't really know what heat stroke is, so that's quite an interesting one. But yeah, your blood pressure, your body just can't maintain blood pressure because you don't have enough water in your body. And what that tends to cause is cardiac arrhythmias. So your heart stops beating correctly, your body then just basically starts to not work.
So rarely I think that you'd ever have someone going to the baths, drinking heavily there after being dehydrated, who didn't have something else, any other existing condition far worse.
Yeah, because it's going to put, if your blood pressure's low, it's going to put pressure on your immune system, and your immune system's not going to be working properly. So if you are then come into contact with another disease, you are more likely, or will be more likely, to get it because your body won't be able to protect you against it.
And something I was always told, even as a kid and as an adult, if you're ill, drink plenty of water.
Yeah, exactly.
It's the absolute opposite of what's undertaking here. So far, really, we've painted quite a dark picture regarding the baths. I don't think we've positioned the baths as being that panacea to life's ills. I think it was Mary Beard who made this point. If you were someone of meagre means and you lived in Rome, you wouldn't be living in a particularly nice place. You wouldn't have running water. You may not even have natural light. The baths offered you somewhere you could go full of people you could meet.
Yeah.
You might be able to look at really nice sculpture, paintings, friezes on walls, all of these sorts of things. And it just might be something that lifted you in some ways. It's about mental health, which is very much
but it's
in
like
the modern...
holistic well-being is a thing that is coming into the forefront, even from a scientific perspective. It is, if you are happy, if you are positive, you are more likely to be well. It's wellness, and I hate that term because it's been kind of co-opted by a lot of diet companies to try and sell things. There is an argument that if you are mentally well, you are more likely to be physically well, which I presume is what you're trying to say.
Yeah, absolutely. And it might have been. A lot of these people, as I said, and I don't want to push it too hard, we always look at Rome often from the perspective of the rich, the elite. And I'm talking about the poorer citizens, again, who lived in a single room or a couple of rooms. They didn't have much of anything. You go there and you've got your friends, you can exercise, you've got a safe area in some contexts to just enjoy yourself. It would have helped you in that context.
Yeah, I mean, I think from an overall perspective, we're talking a bit doom and gloom in regards to the ways that things could be transmitted, but it obviously wasn't the transmission hellhole that I'm kind of painting it to be, because otherwise they wouldn't have carried on going.
I'd always had it to be that panacea, that thing that you put Roman baths in a city or a town, everyone's healthier. And that's really not the case. So I think much of what we've been discussing is just been trying to reposition that and sort of counter that a tad. But at the same time, Emma's you're absolutely right. If these things were the worst thing you could do, if these were vicious disease hellmouths, then yeah, of course, because that would just wipe out entire areas. And I think also with Rome, you've got to give Rome a bit more credit because it was a huge place. We had a large populace. We have difficulty in giving estimates, but it could be up to 1 million or thereabouts by the middle of the 1st century AD. And of course, if you've got that many people, even with really hygienic conditions, people are going to get ill, they're going to spread disease, and things are going to happen that aren't nice.
Diseases evolve so that they are able to be spread and transmitted in clever, insidious ways. So the fact that they are spreading doesn't mean anything necessarily.
So in the sense of Jerry's final thoughts.
Jerry's final thought, I think that the Roman baths are or were less hygienic than television led me to believe they were.
Yeah.
But not as bad as they could have been.
Yeah. I think that's pretty fair. And
like most things, there's some good, some bad.
Yeah, and also, again, we're talking about a wide variety of bathing establishments. From what Marshall says, there were some which were just really, really dirty and disgusting, and others which were considered far more clean, far more beneficial, shall we say.
Like gyms today.
Yeah, pretty much like gyms today. People, they didn't have what I would call a settled audience. They were competing with each other. And it wasn't in your best interest to kill large numbers of people who are going to come to your baths, because most of the baths would have been private establishments. You don't want to do that.
Nope.
So again, what we're doing though is we're offering a slightly different perspective. Do you have anything more to say on?
No, I just thought it was really interesting. It was interesting. I learned a little bit more about parasitic infections because I'm more of a viral, bacterial type of girl. So that was quite interesting. But no, I thought it was an interesting idea, just looking at adding a bit of science to your ancient history.
Well, I really welcome it. And again, thanks very much for coming along. If we can think of other subjects to gross people out with.
Yeah, I mean, if anyone has any ideas or disagrees with anything I've said or has different thoughts themselves, there could be people out there who are also scientists, so it would be really interesting to hear what they've got to say politely, obviously.
Yeah, you can always go on Twitter @AncientBlogger. Always feel free to say hello and give me any kind of feedback you can do.
Yeah, but if there's anything else, any other areas of things that you think my expertise, so to speak, would be useful, then...
Well, I thought perhaps after mentioning the plague of Athens, we could, at some point in the future, look at likely contenders for what that might have been. Because that was really... It's a very, very interesting and somewhat horrific point in time for a lot of people.
And you know how much I like horrific diseases.
I just want to say thanks again to Emma. Thanks for coming along and talking and educating me, certainly, and scaring me. As I said, I'm always happy to hear any kind of feedback you've got on my podcast, so tweet me @AncientBlogger. If you want to visit my website, it's ancientblogger.com. If you're listening to this on any place that you can leave a review, please leave a review. I don't do it enough. I've got to be honest with you. I should do it more.
I love leaving reviews.
It really helps. But only leave good reviews.
Yeah, only 5-star reviews, please.
Yeah, if you liked it, leave a good review. If you hated it, leave a good review, because we're not far from Christmas and Santa is watching you. Until next time, keep safe and stay well.
Bye.
Infamy! Infamy! They've all got it in for me!